Good morning, biology, and welcome to Chapter 21, which is all about ecosystems. So, we spent a lot of time talking about individual organisms and communities and populations, and we're going to get even broader and just look at really, really broad systems called ecosystems. So, these are really big uh, chunks of area, usually, that house a lot of organisms. And we're going to look at what kind of organisms they can house, what kind of environmental factors they need, and that kind of thing. So you might have heard of biomes, uh, but what we're going to talk about is a lot of biome stuff to start with, and then we're going to talk about marine stuff afterwards. So what is a biome? Biomes are terrestrial ecosystems that contain smaller but related ecosystems inside of them. And biomes can be found in more than one place around the world. Looking at this map here, you can see that there is a uh, a desert biome. This kind of uh, orangey color here. There's one in America. There's one in South America here. There's one over in more Asian area. So each place that you find a desert in the world, you're going to see that it has similar habitat, similar climate, and because of that, there are creatures that live in the desert that have similar adaptations. Maybe lots of them burrow into the sand during the day so that they stay cool. So what characterizes a biome? Biomes are commonly identified by their dominant plant life. Whatever plant life is most commonly seen in the area is usually what we're going to look at first. But what creates biomes are abiotic factors, and these are things like average rainfall, elevation, and average temperature. These latitude also plays a really big role in here, so it could definitely be something that you add to that list. The first biome we're going to talk about is the tundra, and on each of these I have a map of where they are in the world. This is the purple on here is the tundra. And tundra are large, cold, treeless biomes found in the north and can be found down in the south on Antarctica. But these guys are characterized by having a structure called permafrost. And permafrost is a permanently frozen layer of soil underneath the surface that never thaws out throughout the year. And in fact, most of the soil, even that's on top of the permafrost, only thaws for about 8 weeks of the year in the tundra. So most of these exist in the north hemisphere. There's some in the south hemisphere on Antarctica. It is the coldest biome of the biomes. Some creatures that inhabit the tundra are these ones shown here, but there's not many trees to be found because permafrost prevents their roots from moving into the soil, and also a lot of plant life. There's very little precipitation, and the growing season is 2 months. Most of the precipitation is snow instead of rain, so that's not as usable for plants. Despite this, we still have some really hardy grasses, things called sedges and mosses that are common, and then we have a whole bunch of animals that can live there too, or that travel in and out of the area. And these include caribou, muskox, snowy owls, arctic foxes, and snowshoe hares. There's other things on here like snow leopards and bald eagles and walruses and stoats, but those are just a couple examples. All right, the next biome is the tropical forest. This is a biome that occurs near the equator between 23.5 degrees north and 23.5 degrees south. This is, if you're a geography buff, this is the Tropic of Cancer and Tropic of Capricorn. And this area is known as, collectively, the tropics. So this area has a stable year-long temperature. It has lots and lots of rainfall, and it has only two seasons. It has wet season and a dry season. Because of this, this is the most productive biome, meaning there's a lot of biomass, meaning there's a lot of plants that are growing really fast and doing really well. And speaking of plant life, there's a lot of competition amongst plants in the tropical forests for light. So most trees are going to 164 or 197 feet tall, and their limbs and their foliage creates this canopy here that you can see in this bottom picture. This really thick layer shades the forest floor below, so there's not a lot of plant life going on down there. You do get what are called epiphytes, and this is like this orchid here, but they're plants like mosses, orchids, and bromeliads that live on the plant branches of trees but make their own food. So they still photosynthesize, but their roots don't need to be in soil. So who lives in the tropical rainforest? These biomes, because they have so much productivity, have some of the highest species richnesses. A hectare, which is the size of 2 football fields, may be home to 300 tree species alone, not even including the animals. If you were in a deciduous forest, you would see probably 12 species of trees in that same amount of area. It also has many unique animal species, such as these ones up here. But something fun about the rainforest is it's estimated that there's 1 million species of tree-living beetle alone. And here we have a picture of the Hercules beetle. He's very fun looking guy there. But tons and tons of beetles and other kind of arboreal animals there. All right, temperate forests. These ones are characterized by having distinct seasons, so spring, summer, fall, and winter. They're usually characterized by the type of tree that is most common in that forest. So it's going to be coniferous trees where they bear seeds and cones, tend to be evergreen. Things like spruces, pines, and firs here. And then deciduous trees, which shed their leaves every year. Things like oaks, maples. This is a sugar maple, and other kind of trees there. You can see where our temperate forests are in the world. We're going to talk about the temperate deciduous forest a little bit more specifically. Compared to taiga, these have warmer winters and longer summers. They have broad, thin leaves. They have with large surface area to help them absorb the maximum amount of light. And inside of here we have bears, wolves, white-tailed deer, opossums, salamanders, tortoises, frogs. All of these kind of animals present. Our next biome is the taiga, and this is one that is occurring between temperate forests and the tundra. Something unique about the taiga is it's only found in the northern hemisphere. There is no taiga in the south hemisphere. This exists between the areas of 50 degrees north and 60 degrees north latitude. It's this green up here. It's a really big biome. And even though these areas still have long winters and a lot of snow, this snow is covering the ground and protecting it from freezing, unlike the tundra, which is kind of more exposed and it's more hospitable to plant life. Lots of organisms call the taiga home. We have coniferous trees here at the taiga, and they have those waxy, needle-shaped leaves that stay on the tree year-round. The reason that they're shaped like needles are to prevent water loss. They're also that wax is to prevent water loss. Some animal species that enjoy these areas are things like moose, bear, wolves, caribou, lynxes, hares, river otters, uh, some fish, some goshawks, spotted salamanders, minks. Many species in this area are going to hibernate, and this usually will happen during the 6 to 8 cold months of the year that this area receives. So still pretty cold, but warmer than the tundra. All right, next biome is the temperate grassland. This usually forms in the interior of continents at the same latitude as temperate deciduous forests. These areas are too dry to support trees, though. So on the map here, you can see that there's kind of this in the middle of continents. These areas have rich, very fertile soil. And in areas that were undisturbed by humans, we have large grazing herds, such as the North American bison, that can kind of inhabit these areas. There are some interactions inside grasslands that are kind of unique. So the grasses are able to and have developed kind of ways to survive being eaten all the way down to just about the roots, and so they can survive this repeated grazing. The grasses are able to survive wildfires as that wildfire burns everything. It burns so fast that it doesn't burn underground. And so those roots that are adapted to store a lot of material will grow after this fire passes. Because a lot of these were coastal areas at one point in time and are now been covered with plant life, and those plants have lived and died, they have very fertile soil. So much of this area, and you can see this map of the United States here, much of this area is farmland, and because of this fertile soil was converted to farmland. So we only have fragments of those grasslands now in the United States that are untouched, that haven't been. Uh, the species all changed, and we call these areas prairies in the United States. Our next biome is the savanna. These are tropical or temperate grasslands that have scattered deciduous trees and shrubs. You can kind of see they're more in the southern hemisphere here. But you get them in Africa, South America, Australia, and bits of Asia. They receive more water than deserts, but less water than either of the tropical or temperate forests. And because of this, they go through a alternating wet and dry season. So this large amount of grasses are able to support herbivores such as zebras, wildebeest, giraffes, gazelles, uh, rhinoceroses, buffalo, all these good things. And then carnivores like cheetahs and lions and leopards will feed on these herbivores, all this food. Um, with this area, some of the trees shed their leaves during the dry season to conserve water, and then they will grow their leaves back once it's the wet season again and it starts to rain. And then, like in the grasslands, the above ground part of grasses usually die, and then once there's rainfall, the roots grow again, and that plant starts over. Alright, our next biome is the Chaparral, and this is a biome that is dominated by dense, spiny shrubs and has scattered coniferous trees. It's kind of like this picture down here. It has mild, rainy winters and hot, dry summers, and these summers are usually have periodic fires throughout them. It's located once again in the middle latitudes between 30 degrees north and 30 degrees south. There is a couple that's lower in the southern hemisphere, but these are primarily in coastal regions. The big chunks being like here around the Mediterranean. In the United States, we have some in Southern California. So what kind of organisms can we expect to find in the chaparral? Usually there's dry oil and there's short woody plants, things like the scrub oak down here. You'll also find plants with shallow root systems, things like sage and other kind of examples. You get monarch butterflies that feed on chaparral plants, and this is a very important region for them on their migration. But you also get lots of insects, and these insects are food to lizards, roadrunners like this guy here, and other predatory bird species that use these guys for food. So even though this area, once again like the deserts that we're going to talk about, looks kind of sparse, life still finds a way to inhabit this and diversify and have some species richness in here. Our next biome is the desert, and these are areas that receive an average of less than 9.9 inches or 25 centimeters of rain each year. They exist all over the world in North America, East Asia, Australia. And these guys aren't always hot. For example, the Great Basin in the United States is hot in the summer and freezes in the winter. And even in um, other deserts, this area does become colder at night, so like 30 degrees colder. The vegetation in these areas is often sparse and usually consists of plants that have adapted to drier climates, things like cactuses and shrubs. So who lives in the desert? Well, desert plants usually have very few stomata or only open at night to conserve water because it's hot in the day and cooler at night. Things like cactuses, you can see this cactus here has these ridges all over it. This allows it to expand and make those ridges smaller when it gets water, and it has spines to protect it from the herbivores of the area. This saguaro here is a large saguaro, and it can probably hold about 2,200 pounds of water when it is completely full. Desert animals usually avoid heat by hiding in the shade or burrowing in the ground. Some of them are only active at night. They include things like rattlesnakes and kit foxes, coyotes, sandcats, tortoises. There can be bighorn sheep in the more higher elevations. If you're in Australia, you've got Barbary ostrich there. If you're in more Africa, Asia, you've got camels. So there are lots of organisms that call the desert home and are adapted to live there. And the final thing we're going to talk about is just the association between precipitation and temperature and where your biome is. So most of these are kind of determined by a combination of rainfall and temperature. Those are the two most important things. And they exist in a range. So if you are really, really cold, area, almost down to freezing, right around 10 degrees Celsius, but have 100 centimeters of rain, you're a temperate deciduous forest. But if you're the same temperature, this 10, and you get less rain, now you're a chaparral or a shrubland. And if you get even less rain, you're a temperate grassland or cold desert. So these things kind of play together to create whatever, biome that you're getting these conditions of. Usually biomes will blend and you won't get like this is a desert and then it all of a sudden changes to a forest. Usually you go a desert and then there's a chaparral or a shrubland next to it, and then you start to get into a deciduous forest, and then maybe there's a temperate rainforest where it rains, like on the coast. So this is the end of 20.1. I will jump into 20.2. All right, the second half of this discussion is about aquatic ecosystems. And a lot of times these are kind of neglected and we don't talk about them as much because as terrestrial creatures, we don't spend a lot of time there. But they are also just incredibly crucial to the kind of the biome of the whole planet, and they hold a lot of the biodiversity of life. So not talking about them would definitely be doing a disservice to our biome. So, reasons we study the ocean: there's around 70% of the Earth's surface is covered by ocean. It has an average depth of around 2.3 miles deep. The deepest parts are down to almost 7 miles. It's 6.8 or 11 kilometers. The water in our oceans contains around 3% salt by volume, and life not only managed to begin here, but thrive here. And we also use it for studying threatened and endangered species. We use it for fishing. It regulates climate and the atmosphere. It helps us for food. We just recreate out in it, fishing and enjoying it. And it's a big area for marine and coastal habitat. So something that's really important is light availability. How much light is available in these areas allows for how much photosynthesis can happen in these areas. And photosynthesis, for the most part, is where energy for ecosystems comes from. So most of the ocean is in this aphotic zone down here, where it is cold and dark. So there is no sunlight reaching down here and no photosynthesis happening because there's no sunlight. The photic zone, however, and even areas of the midwater zone, these are areas that receive light, but the depth that the photic zone is changes from area to area, depending on certain land structures and shade and all of that stuff. Another thing that we'll use to help us break apart ocean zones are the distance from shore. The first one is the intertidal zone here. It is the small area between high tide and low tide. It's covered twice a day and exposed twice a day at high tides and low tides, respectively. Moving out, we have the Neritic Zone, and this is from the intertidal area to the edge of the continental shelf here. And it varies in length depending on how broad the continental shelf is. And then beyond that is the Oceanic Zone, and it's broken into that photic and aphotic. Some other kind of terms that we'll use are pelagic versus benthic. And so the ocean and the Neritic zones are further divided into these zones, where pelagic is the open ocean above the seafloor, and benthic is this area right on the seafloor where organisms can live. And so this is a picture here of what a benthic ecosystem might look like. You've got some anemones and some sea stars and some various kind of species living there and making their homes there. Looking specifically at the intertidal zone here, organisms that live here, like sea stars and barnacles here, are adapted to this periodic exposure to air during low tide. They're not always in the marine environment. Sometimes they are in open air. So some examples of some adaptations are crabs will burrow into the mud to kind of stay in that moister area. Clams, mussels, and oysters here, these guys up here, mussels, will retreat into their shells during the low tide, and then once the water comes back open, they'll open up and start to feed again. They also have to be able to sustain the force of waves crashing in over the top here, so they have to have very good suction to whatever they're attached to. These guys use their tube feet. These guys create like a cement that they put down on the rock to help them attach. The next area is the Neritic Zone. This is the most productive zone of the ocean. It is the one where a higher number of species and species richness going on than any of the other zones. It's shallow enough to get light. It has what we call upwellings, where these currents from the bottom will move nutrients to the top, and then those nutrients will circulate back around. This upwellings is really, really important because we don't have this in the next area, in the Oceanic Zone. We don't get these really strong upcurrents that recycle nutrients back around through this ecosystem. So something that lives in the Neritic Zone that's important to talk about is plankton. And these are communities of small organisms that are usually microscopic that drift on the ocean currents. There are two main types of plankton that we kind of subcategorize plankton as. And plankton is a really weird, they're communities of small organisms. So that means that there's lots of different species inside of these communities. So phytoplankton here, these little guys here, they are taking in sunlight, using photosynthesis to make food. They are very fun shaped and colored, and yeah, they just look very unique to me. And then on the bottom here we have zooplankton, and there's a couple species here, and they are microscopic animal species, including but not limited to the larvae of lots of worms and crustaceans that live in the ocean. So both of these are important food sources. These guys are usually eaten by primary consumers, and these guys usually by secondary consumers. So what else lives in the Neritic Zone? We get coral reefs forming in this zone. These are built from animals. These are from coral animals. And the structures that are left over here are those calcium carbonate skeletons that the dead organisms left behind. As they die, the skeletons are on the bottom, and then new organisms grow on the top of it. This is home to crustaceans and mollusks and other animals. Many reefs have mutualistic relationships with photosynthetic protists. This allows them the ability to share food, and the protists get protection. The next zone is the Oceanic Zone. It includes the deepest parts of the ocean. The nutrient levels are low even in the sunlit areas because we don't have that upwelling that happens. But in the upper part, we do have photosynthetic protists, we have bacteria, we have plankton that are producing energy, we have fish, mammals, whales, large invertebrates like squids, and jellyfish, all of those things. We do break the Oceanic Zone down sometimes into, based on the level of light, a little further. We'll go photic, twilight, midnight, abyss, and then hadal. These get a little sticky, so you won't see everyone using them, but they are ways that people have colloquially talked about the different zones of the oceanic region. So organisms that live in the aphotic zone here primarily feed on what's called marine snow, which is a lot of sinking plankton and dead organisms. Um, this will feed organisms that then get eaten by these guys, the anglerfish here and the comb jelly. But to live here, you have to have adaptations to survive huge pressures and cold temperatures. So you usually see small bodies to disproportionately large jaws, squishy bodies here. But organisms down here have slow metabolism, large jaws and teeth, and expandable stomachs. Because when they do eat, they usually eat very big meals that last them a long time. So it includes things like squid, anglerfish, comb jellies. Your humpback whales will dive down to here sometimes to feed. We also get these really unique communities around deep sea vents in the Oceanic Zone. So these environments revolve around having one of these volcanic vents down there. Most of them are found about 8,200 feet or 2,500 meters below the surface. And these vents release water here that is rich in minerals and that is very hot. These vents usually exceed temperatures of 1350 degrees Fahrenheit. So bacteria and that are the producers in the area use energy from hydrogen sulfide, H2S, from these vents to create their energy. The organisms living here include clams, crabs, some worms, feed on the bacteria. These are some of the examples of the worms here. They have tubes that they're living in. These tube worms have lost all their digestive system and receive their food directly from chemosynthetic bacteria in their body, so they don't eat anything. They intake the hydrogen sulfide, the bacteria in their body make it into energy, and then they share that energy with them. So they have that mutualistic kind of relationship there that allows them to live down here. Without it, they wouldn't be able to survive. The last kind of saltwater area we're going to talk about is estuaries, and this is where we have freshwater streams flowing into the sea or the ocean or some kind of marine body. So examples of these include bays, mudflats, mangrove swamps, deltas, salt marshes. All of these are areas where you have this freshwater and this saltwater mixing. Because they're coming off the continent, they usually have shallow water here, so there's lots of room for photosynthesis, and they receive lots of nutrients that are farming down the river and flowing into this ecosystem here. So because they have both salt and freshwater, they get variations in both temperature and salinity of those two water bodies mixing. Also, the top layer here is partly exposed during low tides and then partly covered during high tides. So inhabitants here have to be really flexible and adapted for changes in both salinity, temperature, and level of water. So there's a lot going on here. So they usually end up being very specialized organisms that live here. So mangrove trees are a great example. They have glands that eliminate or get rid of excess salt water that are taken up by the roots and pump them back out into the water around them. This is to make sure that they keep that osmotic pressure and their turgor pressure strong so that they can remain standing upright and continue to grow. All right, the next areas we're going to talk about for water zones are the freshwater zones. And this is any water ecosystem that has about 0.05% or less salt water. Remember that seawater had 0.03. So these are ones that have significantly less salt water than the ocean environments, the marine environments. Some examples are lakes, ponds, freshwater wetlands, clear mountain streams such as this one, and rivers. When we talk about lakes and we talk about ponds, we break them down into two types. And there's argument for a third. The first is eutrophic, which is rich in organic matter and vegetation, usually murky. So you see that this one has a lot of growth happening here, both bacterial and algal on the bottom. This supports a lot of different life forms. And then you have oligotrophic, where it contains little organic matter and is usually clear. So these ones you can see there's less biodiversity. It's clearer water, but there's not as much algae or other kind of producers growing here. So it's going to be less available food in oligotrophic versus eutrophic lakes and ponds. In rivers and streams, this is any freshwater body that is flowing down a gradient, so down a slope. If you are in a faster gradient, that means you're going to have a faster river or stream. Usually there's a correlation between the slower the river or stream, the more nutrient rich it will be, as organisms have time to photosynthesize in there and live in there, versus a river where everything gets swept down towards the mouth really, really quickly. But organisms that live in those quick moving waters have to have adaptations to live inside of those rapid currents. So this caddisfly here, he is providing a rocky shell here that he hides in. He is the whole length of this puppy. When he is ready to grow into his next form, which is the caddisfly, he will emerge from here and be ready to go. For our next freshwater feature here, we have freshwater wetlands. And these are areas of water that are covered with freshwater for at least part of each year. There are many different types of these. If you're a marsh, you contain non-woody plants such as cattails here. If you're a swamp, you contain woody plants such as trees and shrubs. If you're in a bog, like here, these have sphagnum mosses and they don't have a lot of like really tall vegetation. And then in fen, it contains peat moss, which eventually will shrink down to form coal. So all four of these are examples of these freshwater wetlands, and they are the most productive type of freshwater ecosystems. And there's a lot of reasons that these are important. They are habitats for many mammals, amphibians, reptiles, and fish year-round. They're also stopover locations for migratory birds, like this picture here. They provide protection for spawning organisms, such as amphibians and fish, and they filter out pollutants and act as flood control. They allow, as water fills up in here, it holds a lot more water than like a river would, so that it protects areas around it from getting really high floods. This is the conclusion to chapter 21. So we've talked about lots of different ecosystems, both terrestrial and aquatic, kind of what defines them, what lives there. I hope you enjoyed this one. If you have any questions, let me know, and we'll see you in the next one.